welcome to Fast Forward, where we have ongoing conversations about living in the future. I'm Dan Costa, editor-in-chief of PCMag.com, and my guest today is David Kirkpatrick. David has spent 25 years writing about technology and business for Fortune magazine. He's now the founder, host, and editor-in-chief of Techonomy, the jewel of which is a conference out in Half Moon Bay, which will be happening in just a couple of weeks. He's also the author of the best-selling Facebook Effect, the inside story of the company that is connecting the world. We're going to talk about why he started Techonomy. We're going to talk about how tech is driving change in both the business world and in the technology world. And of course, will Facebook ever change its ways? David, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. I have to tell you one other thing. I actually wrote a column called Fast Forward at Fortune.
Is that correct?
For a few years back in the day, yeah.
So thank God you've moved on.
I love the name.
Thank God you've moved on. Otherwise, this could be copyright infringement.
No, I moved well on. I left Fortune.
That's right. So you left Fortune after a long period of time. I think a lot of people know your writing from that time. Really chronicled the entire technology boom, the entire rise of the tech industry. You get out of that work and you can do anything you want, and you decide to start Techonomy. Why did you start Techonomy, and what were your goals there?
Well, one of the things that I became really convinced of when I was at Fortune was the importance of integrating the conversation about tech with this conversation about the future of society. I think that is even still not done often enough, because tech is so complicated in its own right that understanding what it's doing to us is hard. Although right now, I think more than in any time in my career, that is a very prominent discussion at the societal level, because so many things are going wrong because of tech. But also, when I was at Fortune, I had the privilege of going to the World Economic Forum for many years, and it helped me realize the value of getting diverse people together just to talk about stuff. And it's not just the networking, it's really like the suffusion in ideas. And I started at Fortune a conference called Brainstorm, which was inspired to some extent by Davos. And then it was so successful for me, and quite successful for Fortune, and still is, in fact, that when I left Fortune to write my book about Facebook, I really wanted to continue doing events, but take it to an even bigger picture context. And it happened that I had a URL called Techonomy that I'd owned for over a decade at that point, just because I knew it was a good word for something. And so I decided to use that as sort of the organizing principle with some colleagues in starting this company for an ongoing discussion about how technology really is fused with all of the economy and society, and what does that mean?
And so the people, a lot of what makes Techonomy unique are the people that you invite and the people that you bring to the stage, and then the conversations they have. You know, what makes Techonomy different than the other tech conferences out there, like the Codes and the D-Lives?
Well, for one thing, we don't think of it as a tech conference. That's ironic. Even though it has tech in its name, we really think of it as a general business and society conference that's founded on the premise that technology alters everything. So it's kind of like technology's at the table of every conversation we have, but our conversations are about democracy, the economy, the future of transportation, healthcare, education, addiction, our personal lives, longevity, global geopolitics. Those are the things we're really interested in, because ultimately tech is not that interesting or important. What's really interesting is what's the future of humanity? And that's what we're interested in. And I don't think those other events, good as they are, and I love all of them, and I support all of them, they're not the same.
It's also, there's an element of, I won't say necessarily confrontation, but definitely a level of engagement that's higher at Techonomy, where you've got journalists asking questions. You can be a very tough interview for people that come onto the stage. And I feel like it's like a genuine search for something more than just talking points.
That's very nice of you to say. I mean, I'll tell you one thing, we prepare the heck out of it, as you know, because you're coming and you're going to moderate some stuff. We really believe that it's like a living magazine. That's the way we think of it. That's kind of, and I guess it comes from my years at Fortune. It's like, if going to Techonomy, it's like you're walking into the pages of a really good issue of a really good magazine. And so you're kind of suffused in this whole range of ideas that if we do it right, we'll sort of all kind of reflect on one another and allow you to walk away with sort of a 1 + 1 = 3 kind of bigger picture understanding of the world we live in, and that, that we don't have ourselves. We don't understand anything. We're not claiming that we get it. We just believe there's so much going on that we need to present to our community to help them help us draw conclusions.
So you mentioned like walking into the pages of a really great magazine. You're still publishing an actual print magazine,
We do.
Also of the name Techonomy.
Yeah.
Why do you do that, and how much longer do you think you're going to be able to do that?
We're going to keep doing that indefinitely, and in fact, we very well may increase the frequency of our magazine. We publish it just twice a year at the moment, and to some extent, realistically, it's more or less a marketing exercise. We don't make money from the magazine per se, although our partners have ads in there and everything. We have found, and it's one of those contrarian, sort of counterintuitive, I should say, things that you really begin to appreciate when you really step back and ask, how is technology changing or not changing the world? People still respond extraordinarily well to print. And younger people are increasingly, in their analog obsession, really into print. I'm still into print. I still get the Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the FT on paper every day, and I know I digest more information that way than if I only use their apps, and I use all their apps as well. I just do everything, but the paper is a uniquely useful method of information transmittal, and our magazine is perfect for reading on an airplane. People love to get it. We do tremendous hard work with the production values so that it is truly a beautiful, highly produced, sophisticated, professional, real journalistic magazine. And first of all, I love doing it because I'm a 35-year magazine person, but also people really digest the information better, and I think it really enhances our brand, believe it or not.
And it creates a sense of permanence that you just don't find on the web. So I think pretty much everything you publish in the magazine is also available online.
Eventually, we put it all online.
But it seems like having it around your apartment or your house for a month, 2 months, like it creates some stickiness, and people actually make it through all the articles. Whereas I read hundreds of stories every day. The stories in a magazine I actually remember, and I have a sense of place attached.
Don't you get a lot of magazines in print too?
I do. I just resubscribed to the New Yorker after letting it go because I was like, oh, I'll be able to read it all online. It's not the best way to read long form content, and I will never read those stories online.
Well, for one thing, it is known cognitively that we retain information better on paper than on a screen. I can do a pretty good digestion of information on a screen, and I read screens as much as you do. I mean, I'm like, I like to have the New York Times in my lap and then read an article on my phone, and I go back and forth. It's crazy. It doesn't make any sense, but I think it's the way we are. And also our magazine, again, because we make it really beautiful, people want to keep it around. And we do put an enormous amount into the graphics and the illustrations. The illustration of the cover of the one that's about to come out is really killer. And people are going to be, I think, shocked by it, but also glad to have it.
How can people get it?
Well, if they really want a copy of our magazine, they should just send us a note and we'll send it to them.
There you go. So let's talk about the conference. You've obviously written about Facebook. You continue to write a lot about Facebook and sort of the evolving controversies they keep enmeshing themselves in.
Yeah, there's so many, aren't there?
It's nonstop. And yet...
That's because they're doing a really bad job managing their company.
Their stock has taken some hit, but I don't know a lot of people that have quit Facebook over this, consumers. And I don't know that a lot of advertisers are not using them to do targeting. And so I think their business is still doing pretty well. Is this going to go business as usual? People just move on and accept this is what Facebook does? Or is there going to be another path that's going to be even more painful for Facebook?
I think they're walking a deeply painful path right now, and I don't think they've found the resolution to their difficulties. Certainly the service and their business is not going away because people like what Facebook offers them, the community, the interaction with other people. The news feed is a very well-conceived distribution tool. But in fact, use of Facebook is declining in the United States and in other developed countries, more among younger people than among baby boomers like me. And I don't know whether you're a baby boomer, but maybe you are. But, basically, Facebook has a crisis of use that is not really directly connected to the issues of fake news or privacy invasion. I think a lot of people just sort of have a feeling that they don't like it as much anymore, and they're using Instagram more, or they're using Twitter and Instagram more, or if they're younger, they're using Snap more, or if they're in other countries, they might be using WhatsApp, which Facebook also owns. Facebook's very well hedged, because even as it's losing use on its core platform, WhatsApp, Instant Message, Facebook Messenger, and Instagram are just soaring in usage. So they're very fortunate in that regard. But I think they didn't know what they were walking into in terms of the myriad ways that the service that they created could be abused. And as a result, they did not build the governance that they needed in order to properly run this service. The catchphrase that I use is they focused on growth, not governance. And it's especially problematic, not for us here in the United States, but for people in less affluent countries all around the world, many of whom Facebook is the #1 media in those countries, and yet Facebook has no local language speakers on its staff, or almost none, or if they have any, they just hired them last week. They have no local cultural expertise. In many of these languages, they didn't even translate their community standards into that language until the last couple of years. So literally, until recently, the people that were using these services by the millions in some of these countries didn't even have to follow any rules, because there were no rules in that language. Facebook allowed that to happen. They encouraged it to happen because they were pursuing growth at all costs out of a fear that somebody else would get there first. And the consequences of that are deeply pernicious. And we've seen it most obviously in Myanmar and Sri Lanka, places where genocide literally has been happening on Facebook, where the government in Myanmar has been proven to have been using Facebook to encourage genocidal hatred and slaughtering of the Muslim minority there. It's just unconscionable that Facebook did so little to stop this, because they knew about it years ago and they chose to ignore the warnings. And I find that inexcusable.
Where do you think the greatest risks are to both people abroad and in the United States? Is it the government misuse of Facebook and its platform, and that includes political campaigns? Is it private companies that are using it for advertising purposes and segmenting purposes and data discovery purposes? Or is it the users themselves who are just creating a negative environment and injuring one another?
Or being addicted and hurting themselves.
Right.
I mean, I think all those things are happening. But for me, by far the most worrisome consequence of Facebook's epidemic of misuse is in democracy. And the way that governments and political parties are finding it easy to break the rules on Facebook and basically distribute propaganda. And Facebook's extremely inept at preventing that. And unfortunately, increasingly, as Facebook does start to try to prevent it in some ways, those same forces are moving onto WhatsApp in many countries, or Facebook Messenger in other countries, or Instagram. And all these other platforms are becoming infected by these same epidemics of misuse. But I happen to believe that if you look at what's happening in the world today, probably the most disturbing thing, I think, in the world right now is this global shift toward populism. You know, we've just seen an extreme right-wing populist guy elected in Brazil who's, openly traffics in racism and hatred of gays and anybody who's perceived as the other. We've got really reactionary nationalistic governments in Turkey, Hungary, Poland, Austria, the Philippines, and many other countries. And those are some of the most egregious examples. We have Brexit having happened. We have, Marine Le Pen almost won election in France.
Facebook is one of the common denominators.
Facebook is a common denominator in all those, because all of those parties, all of those leaders are experts at Facebook propaganda, and they have not bothered with the niceties of the rules. If they feel that a message will help them get elected or stay in power, they will distribute it. And Facebook is extremely poor at identifying those false, misleading, propaganda, dishonest messages. And even when Facebook does have the ability to identify them, what is happening is that because these countries, these governments are often in power in the countries, and Facebook says we abide by the laws of the country, the laws of the country are increasingly being established by people who are professionally abusing the rules of Facebook. So Facebook's between a rock and a hard place. If they really enforce their rules, they're basically coming down on the government that they require to give them license to operate in that country. And they allowed all this to happen because they didn't think about it. And that's exactly what's happening in places like Myanmar, the Philippines, Turkey, Hungary. And they don't really have a strategy. And they don't want to talk about it. I guarantee you, you have never, ever seen anyone from Facebook publicly address what I just talked about. This incredible contradiction between operating in these countries that are led by either neo-fascists or undemocratic, populists who are absolutely not abiding by the rule of law themselves, and abuse Facebook, and yet they are the government of the country. That is just something Facebook would like to bury their head in the sand and pretend is not happening.
So similar, Facebook's not the only company that has to make these types of choices.
No, it's not, sadly. It's just the biggest of that sort.
Google's negotiating with the Chinese government to decide whether or not they're going to be allowed into the country, and then the Chinese government has conditions, and they want to control those search results.
Right.
And they're going back and forth, and I don't think it's resolved yet.
No.
But is this a situation where should Google negotiate and make a deal with the Chinese government, or should they say no? Either it's open, free Google, the same search results that appear in the United States, or we're going to give up that market.
Well, actually, I'm not as critical of Google as I am of Facebook because I don't think it's abused in the same way, although YouTube has a lot of related problems, but not as bad. I would not presume to tell Google what to do regarding the Chinese situation because I can see an argument why a dumbed-down Google is better than no Google in the Chinese context. Just as I can see the argument why, working for the federal government or the Pentagon in some cases may be better than the alternative of letting somebody else do it. I don't think that these are simple questions, and I don't say that no tech company ought to work for the Pentagon or for ICE or for China. I think every situation is different. We live in a technologized society, and these companies have a right to get business where they can, but they also have to abide by certain ethical and moral principles. And I don't think in general that ethical and moral principles have been applied methodically by these companies. I mean, Google famously for years said, don't be evil, but I'm afraid they never really stopped to think of what it meant, or they did for a while, and Sergey Brin proudly announced they were pulling out of China a few years ago, and now Sergey Brin is not really involved in the leadership of Google anymore, and they're tiptoeing back in. China is a very, very difficult technological situation and question. I mean, there's so many interesting and challenging issues surrounding the intersection of China and the rest of the world, and technology in China with technology in the rest of the world. China is the world's largest internet market. China is the country after the United States that has the most technology. It's the country after the United States that has the most important and globally aspirational tech companies. But China is led, again, by a government that seeks control at all times, and it isn't really possible to operate in China without doing whatever the government wants. So you're not really autonomous in China, whether you're Google or Alibaba or Tencent. And that's a very, very perilous situation. Unfortunately, I think given the governmental developments that we were talking about before, we may be heading towards something very similar in every country. I mean, if you want to really get into how scary it is, if these kinds of super controlling, rule ignoring governments like we've just seen elected in Brazil, and we have in all these other countries already, and even what's happening in our own country, you know, you can envision a scenario where governments in almost all these countries are going to essentially insist on a backdoor, on control, on influence, and the autonomy that we've come to sort of accept is part of capitalism. You know, capitalist companies can basically operate as long as they're abiding by the laws. Abiding by the laws may increasingly mean doing exactly what the government wants. So that's pretty scary.
There's a fundamental gap between what these technologies were intended to do. We thought that the information wanted to be free, the internet was going to provide communication, everyone would be able to publish, the government wouldn't be able to keep information from being distributed. You know, these were supposed to be liberalizing technologies, and instead they're being used by totalitarian regimes. Why is that? Like, what is it about the technology? Where's the power of the to harness these networks and harness these technologies in order for progressive force, for progressive means?
First of all, I think all those idealistic dreams did come true for a while. You know, Arab Spring happened, and then the government of Egypt realized, hey, if we have a police force that's just organized to get inside Facebook, we can control the narrative. And the same thing happened in Turkey. You know, basically, and China, you know, Facebook was about to launch in China. And then Arab Spring came along, and the Chinese government said, gee, we don't want a social network bringing down our government, so I don't think we're going to let Facebook operate here. And, you know, governments and the forces of control and power in society wised up and realized that they too could take advantage of the openness of these technologies, which originally was something that only people like you and maybe me and the idealists like John Perry Barlow, one of the great apostles of the view you described, you know, those were the only people that understood it for the first 15 years of the internet. And then Facebook came along, and Facebook really was a turning point. It was so effective at empowering the individual that governments said, we just simply can't allow this. How can we take advantage of this for ourselves? And now that's what they're doing. But to go to your question, it's not so much that I think the left ought to do it, but I do think there is enormous opportunity for innovation around technologies of genuine freedom. There's certainly plenty of people in the crypto space and blockchain and Bitcoin space who believe that that's what they're doing. I think probably the prospects of them succeeding is smaller than they would generally like us to believe. But it's encouraging to see the rhetoric, at least, that surrounded the whole crypto evolution since Bitcoin was invented, because it goes to show there is a significant strand of the tech community and even of money, entrepreneurial, venture-backed entrepreneurial innovation that really sees the opportunity for technologies of freedom to continue to be improved and innovated around. We need radical new innovation. To me, it's not so much about the left, though. I've been thinking in light of, you know, the bomb threats and murders in synagogues and all these horrific things, since so much social media has been, you know, implicated in the, you know, the whole echo chamber filter bubble that caused these people to become deluded enough to do these horrific, stupid, ignorant, misinformed things, that people in tech, people like ourselves who understand tech, have to devote a lot more time and thinking and money to how can we innovate around technologies that will bring people together. That's what we need. And interestingly, I thought Facebook was that. That's one reason I wrote my book, The Facebook Effect, because Facebook really was that for a while. Just like I said before, you know, in the early days, these things really were that, and then they got distorted, and now Facebook has essentially increasingly been taken over by the forces of control. And Facebook doesn't know how to stop it. But, you know, even today, just quickly, let me finish. Even today, Zuckerberg talks about Facebook as a place for global community, right? He sees the need. He's right that we need technologies for global community, for helping people see contrarian views, where we can have dialogues with people from the other side of the political spectrum in whatever country, certainly our own. We need this. We need much more cross-cultural understanding of every type, between races, between religions, between political views, and technology has to be harnessed to do that better. And I know it can be, But right now, we're not seeing it happen.
I think one of the things that are different from that idealistic age and the age that we're in now is the concentration of power. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg talks about creating a global community, but it's one global community. It's a global community that flows through Facebook itself.
Right.
And in many of these countries, like you said, the internet is Facebook. There is no other internet. When we were coming up, there were lots of different websites. There were lots of different services. There were different dial-up providers. All of that power has been concentrated now, so that
so he got to be worth $85 billion at one point, right?
And the same thing is happening on the web with Google, where they're dominating search, and they're shaping they're shaping the web in a way that no other company ever has, because that first page of search returns are so important. And that is a relatively new thing. And it's very different from when there was a lot more competition. There was more innovation back then. Right. So just the fact that Facebook is so big. And
and so Google too. I mean, and let's face it, certain companies like Apple, Amazon, bring to the fore very similar issues. I mean, to be honest, Amazon has to be mentioned. The sheer variety of power, different forms of power that Amazon is attempting to aggregate unto itself is truly astonishing. What did I just recently see? They now have 680,000 employees or something like that. It's over 600,000. And
reshape the retail industry.
They don't just control commerce, man. They want to control entertainment. They want to control, they're the back end for business.
Yeah.
AWS is a back end for all of business increasingly. So in effect, they own the information store for almost every company increasingly. Should that be allowed? Is that healthy? Where's the public dialogue? Where's Congress's debate on this? Congress in the US, the UN, all these entities of governance around the world need to turn their sights way more methodically on the way that technology is altering the landscape. And I do think, probably for the best, that the crises that have surrounded Facebook in particular have caused a new awareness on the part of governments around the world that they need to think more methodically about how technology is changing society and what government ought to do about it. But there's a very serious caveat on that one too, if I could just quickly give it to you. Every single politician in the world today got elected using Facebook in their campaign. All of them do. You don't get elected anywhere without using Facebook these days. So unfortunately, politicians in every democratic country have no incentive to see Facebook change. It worked for them, and these people, many of them, are very selfish and short-sighted. They want power. They want to maintain power. So intrinsically, their interest is not to undermine the platform that allowed them to get where they are. And that, I think, is going to be a very difficult thing to get over. I think we've seen it even in some of the questions when Zuckerberg was testifying before Congress. If you'll recall how Ted Cruz was complaining to him about he can't campaign as well on Facebook as he used to. That's what these people really care about. Ted Cruz is like a open id. He just says, he's so selfish that he says what he really thinks. And he acknowledged indirectly that that's all he cares about with Facebook is it going to help him or not? And unfortunately, that is a global problem.
I think there's some, I was trying to think of examples because it seems so unlikely that the US Congress will be able to regulate anything in this current environment. But just last year we pushed through GDPR, the Europeans did, and every tech company in America had to jump through hoops to make sure they were GDPR compliant and still stay GDPR compliant. There are some parts of that law that are ridiculous, but I mean, it was an effort to protect the privacy of European citizens, and as a result, everyone else got protections as well. Do you think that's a model? Can the Europeans lead the way here?
The Europeans, by definition, are leading the way. There's no question. I mean, now we hear from American politicians increasingly that we need a version of GDPR for the United States. And Tim Cook himself said that recently. So the tech industry, some of them are getting on board. And Facebook, even in the last few weeks, has itself said they support some version of that. We have a law in California that was modeled in part on GDPR. I'll tell you an interesting thing, though, that many people don't know. The European Parliament and the European Commission have a tech directorate that has something like 1,100 full-time government employees whose job is to understand what's happening in tech. So when the European Commission started having hearings and investigations around, Google, Facebook, privacy, Amazon, monopoly, they've looked at all these companies quite intelligently. It's partly because they had a real back end of research that the United States lacks. There is no technology research arm of the Congress. There used to be, but Newt Gingrich closed it down during his wonderful reign as Speaker of the House. There used to be something called the, I forget what it was called, but there was for decades, a congressional technology office of some sort that really was a research operation. So it's not a coincidence. It's not only because the Europeans have been so concerned about privacy ever since the Nazis took over most of the continent, but that's probably the single biggest reason. But they also understand tech better. Plus, the companies that dominate are Americans, so they also had a little bit of an incentive to say, hey, screw you, you're not from here. We'll tell you what you can and can't do. There's a whole variety of dynamics that led to Europe becoming the world leader in regulation of tech. But I think in the end, it turned out to be to the benefit of all of us, even though some of the things they've done, I think, have gone overboard. And they will continue to be in the vanguard because they are more methodical and they've already taken a lot of these steps and they're going to keep taking further steps.
Let's change industries a little bit. One of the things I always go to at Techonomy is find out about the future of transportation. Ken Washington from Ford is going to be there. We've heard him talk many times about how Ford is a mobility company, not an auto company. There's certainly lots of signs of that in the economy itself. But do you think that the big car companies are going to be able to lead the way here in revolutionizing everything from the types of devices, the types of vehicles we're using, the types of fuel we're using, or is it going to be one of these smaller startups?
Well, let's face it, Tesla has had an enormous influence over the global auto industry. Tesla's success, which has been real, even though they've struggled.
They're vaguely profitable now.
Well, they're actually suddenly doing better than we thought. But yeah, Ford in particular, but all the auto companies have been obsessively attending to Tesla ever since Tesla came on the scene. And Ford's CMO said that on stage at Techonomy a few years ago. Jim Farley, who now runs a big part of the company. So yes, a startup is the one that came in and kind of told them all, hey, it's about electrification, it's about autonomy, and it's also and then you had Uber coming in and Lyft and others saying it's about ride hailing, because those are the three separate sort of strands of entrepreneurial transformation that are underway in auto-related mobility. And auto companies have no choice, and they realize they have no choice. They're all getting on board that bandwagon. So, some of them may go away. Some of them may make the transition successfully. I think from a point of view of electrification, they're all going to get there pretty fast. Autonomy, I think probably everyone will end up getting there at about the same time, because in the end, government is the gating factor there. And I think the technology is not going to be holding us up as so much as the public's acceptance and what is legally allowed and how the insurance industry responds, etc. Ride hailing is happening at such an incredible pace that, I have a 26-year-old daughter who couldn't care less about a car. She doesn't even think of, she grew up in Manhattan, she doesn't even know how to drive, and she doesn't ever want to own a car, would be my impression from her so far.
Mm-hmm. There's, and then the whole scooter phenomenon, which is isolated. It's not in every city, it's not in New York City, but if you go to LA and you go to Santa Monica and you see how many people are using scooters, Lime and Bird are both valued at almost $1 billion, and they're providing electric scooters to people to rent by the minute.
I think that'll go away. I think the scooter thing is total bullshit.
Because
certainly in cities like New York, it will not happen. I guarantee you. And first of all, they're dangerous. They're dangerous to pedestrians. They're, it's unhealthy, because you're better off walking. I mean, look.
They also, and the problem is they leave the scooters everywhere.
The scooters are littering the streets. It sounds good, and it's sort of
it's certainly fun at 10 o'clock at night. It's an easy
follow-on to bike renting and ride hailing in vehicles. But I think the scooter thing is just a total red herring that, and the fact that some of these companies have gotten those valuations, to me, goes to show that sometimes fads take over tech investing and entrepreneurship and get out of control. And I have never seen any evidence that those are going to be long-term profitable companies, or certainly not long-term profitable companies at the scale that their valuations would suggest. So some of them may continue to exist. People may still scoot around on rental scooters here and there, but it is not a world-changing industry, and it never will be.
You can rent Segways as well.
I mean, delivery food, there's other, renting Segways, right? I mean,
it's an interesting, and if you Google it and you look for...
Food delivery is a way bigger business.
Yeah, and
just to name one.
I think investors wanted to be in on the ground floor of the next Uber. And meanwhile, right. Uber is already moving on to food delivery.
Right.
Because they've got the infrastructure, and they're like, how can we apply our logistics model to different industries?
Yeah, I mean, look, shared ownership, sharing things, not owning bicycles, not owning scooters, not owning cars, it makes a lot of sense. But you have to apply common sense. I mean, maybe a few millennials want to run around Santa Monica on a scooter. I ain't never going to ride no scooter from here to 14th Street where I live, because I would die in the midstream there. Yeah. And any New Yorker above the age of 25 will not consider trying it, maybe with very few exceptions.
I think there's also geographic differences. I think it may make sense in Santa Monica, although most of the people that live there aren't thrilled about it. That it is not something that's going to translate onto the streets of New York City.
Yeah, I mean, so look, it might take off in a few places and stick, but it's not a big deal. It's not a big deal like Uber was a big deal. And if people think it is, they ought to sit down and meditate for a few minutes.
All right. So the conference is coming up in a couple of weeks. You've got an all-star lineup. Who are you most interested to hear from at the conference?
Well, I just had a prep call with Tony Profit, who's the Chief Equality Officer at Salesforce, an astonishing human being who has a really important message about how companies really need to think about diversity and inclusion. It goes beyond that. It goes to equality, and it's like equality across the board. I'll tell you, a big discussion that is very important at this conference is the issue of personal data and who should control it. We start out with Tim Berners-Lee, who's got a whole new open source project and company devoted to trying to take control of the web and the internet back to the individual. That is probably the single biggest fault line in modern technology, is who owns the data. Facebook went too far in owning and controlling the data. Initially, they sort of acted like it was ours, but then they started really, I think, abusing that privilege. Maybe you could say the same thing about Google. I think Amazon's done a very good job of managing it up to now. We'll see whether they can maintain their position of seeming neutrality around data. They just sell us stuff for what seems to be a decent price, and we forgive them everything. But
it worked for Walmart.
And meanwhile, you have Apple and Microsoft both saying, hey, we are on the people's side of the personal data debate, in the same sort of side as Tim Berners-Lee. And there's a whole bunch of people at the conference from banking companies, from blockchain companies, from all sorts of places who are arguing various parts of healthcare industry of the personal control over data is a critical issue. So that's a subject that will come up throughout the conference. But I think the biggest theme of the conference is, how does the technology industry adapt to the extraordinary and legitimate challenges to its overreach that have been so obviously evidenced in the last year or so? Ever since the election of Trump, when Mark Zuckerberg 2 days later on the stage at Techonomy said it's a crazy idea that fake news on Facebook affected the election of Donald Trump, that statement was kind of like a sea change moment, because it was very quickly proven that he was wrong.
Yeah, and I think he genuinely didn't know.
He genuinely didn't know at that time, which is inexcusable, because some people inside Facebook did know. But he has now apologized for that statement. But I think him making that statement, and then us learning what we learned about the Russian manipulation, Cambridge Analytica, and a whole host of other problems that have followed in the wake of those two scandals, it's really changed the attitude of society towards these companies. I mean, Facebook has essentially become responsible for undermining the reputation of tech writ large, which is pretty amazing that one company could have had such a negative impact on the entire industry. But now a lot of that reputation that was so glamorous and glitzy is really clear was not deserved. These people were basking in their coming out way too far on the wrong side of the inequality spectrum and building products that were heedlessly riding roughshod over a lot of civil rights of citizens, expanding globally too quickly, cooperating with governments in the wrong ways, or not thinking about governance in general in their own systems. So many things they did wrong. And we're kind of left with this moment where, well, how are we going to have a technologized society that works right? Because we don't have a choice. We are in a technologized society, as you know.
You can't uninvent these.
You, like me, have devoted your career to talking about this and understanding this. But it can't keep going the way it's been going. So we have Trump's top tech advisor at the conference trying to talk about how government and the tech industry can work together more effectively. We also have a top former tech advisor to Obama talking about what she's doing with you're interviewing.
I'm going to be interviewing Jen Paulka.
Yeah. That to me is the biggest theme. How does tech recover from the assault that it's facing now, and really ensure that it's doing good for society and that people in society trust that it's doing good for society? I mean, it's not an overnight thing, but that's kind of the macro theme of this conference. And I do think this question of who controls the personal data and whether individuals or companies really are in the lead there is one of the central issues behind that whole challenge.
Yeah, and the question is also if this can be done. I'm very interested to hear Tim's talk about, because he's got a platform, he's got a potential solution that could help us get part of the way. I can't wait to meet him and to talk to him about that, because I appreciate that he's trying to fix where we are.
Yeah, he's trying.
He's trying. We'll see if that works. I want to ask my closing questions that I ask everybody that comes on the show. And I can't say Facebook, but what technological trend concerns you the most? Is there anything that keeps you up at night?
Well, to me, at a macro scale, something we've talked about, the fact that technology is creating these echo chambers politically and ethnically and religiously, and tech is basically drawing us apart rather than bringing us together at the moment, it seems. And that to me is the thing that worries me most about tech right now. I think it's remediable, but I don't see the remediation happening right now.
I think the important thing to note too is that we knew that there were echo chambers. I think what we understand now is that those chambers were built by people on purpose.
Yeah.
They're not accidental. They're built and they're manipulated and they're shaped by politicians, by campaigns, by businesses.
Well, they were generally built on purpose in order to sell ads.
Yeah, that was the foundation.
And they became extraordinarily profitable, but they became too profitable. And the companies that make profits of the level of Google and Facebook don't have the right not to be governing their systems that have allowed them to make such profits. They don't have the right to make those profits and not govern those systems.
Agreed.
Sorry, I said Facebook.
Not a problem at all. Well, I knew you were going to have to. Is there a service, an app, or a device that you use every day that still inspires wonder?
Well, come on.
You've used a lot of devices.
I still feel, much as we have a whole session on this at the conference, technology addiction, my iPhone still amazes me every day with what it can do, even though I, like seemingly everyone, feel myself to be somewhat addicted to it. I'll tell you also, Google Maps continues to be possibly the system that just shocks me with its efficiency time and time again. I think Google has done an unbelievably good job at continually iterating and improving that service so that every time I use it, it does something for me a little better than it did last time. And it's pretty miraculous.
Do you remember the first time you used a consumer GPS device?
Vaguely.
where you could actually, I remember.
Oh yeah, Garmin or something.
Yeah, it was a Garmin, and you could connect it to a laptop.
Right.
And it was extraordinary. Like I was driving through the desert in California, and I could drill down on a map and see a little dot moving along the map. And I had cables and an antenna and a laptop open, and it was extraordinary because I'd never seen myself moving from a satellite.
But you know, an interesting thing to keep in mind about that's because of government technology, industry cooperation. Because if the government hadn't put up all these geostationary satellites so that we had the geolocation services provided initially for the military that were then made available to the general public, we wouldn't have all this geolocation stuff that makes Google Maps and even Garmin so cool.
Yeah, it's a fascinating technology. So finally, how can people find you online, keep up with what you're doing, learn about the Techonomy conference?
Well, Techonomy.com is where I publish most of my writing, where we publish all the articles from our magazine, where we keep people informed about what's happening at our conference. You know, it's not too late if somebody wants to come to the conference to send us a note to info@techonomy.com. And if they want to, if they want to come, well, it's invitation only, but there's a possibility they might be included. It's going to be an extraordinary event. We're unbelievably excited about it. I mean, I've only touched the tip of the iceberg. We have like 50 speakers. John Chambers, really amazing experts in the ethics of AI. We have an amazing 22-year-old YouTube star that has over 1 billion views named Alex Iono performing. We're going to have an intelligence squared debate on the proposition the tech industry has Silicon Valley has lost its soul. That's the proposition people are going to debating pro and con with some really excellent debaters on that. Then we're going to close the conference with a session with Roger McNamee and Wael Ghonim, who was the hero of Arab Spring in Egypt, and also Sanjana Hatatua, who's a Sri Lankan civil rights and digital rights activist, talking about what should Facebook do now. And Roger McNamee, of course, is got a book coming out called Zucked, so you can tell what he thinks. It's just we have the chief marketing officer of Allianz, the world's largest insurer, talking about how they've started to realize that insurance can be an incredible tool for innovation, because when a company needs insurance in the startup realm, that's pretty much when their products are starting to take off. So then Allianz can get involved with them. So many interesting things packed into 2 days, and that's what we try to do. We try to make it unreasonably well packed with amazing ideas, and I think we've succeeded.
Yeah, well, I will definitely be there, so you can count on me in attendance as well.
Look forward to having you there.
David, thanks so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Dan.
That's Fast Forward for today. If you want to hear back episodes, you can find them on PCMag.com, on iTunes, or anywhere fine podcasts are given away for free. Thanks so much for joining us. I'll see you in the future.